He dragged me inside and sat me down next to Evelyn. Evelyn took off her thin sweater as if she had been waiting for this. He was completely free now. He started running his hands around my neck. His lips were hovering on my cheek without feeling it. As she moved her soft lips around my body, I was also becoming free. I haven't felt young for a long time. I found peace with them. He put his hands inside my clothes. The more he moved his hands around my body, the more I passed out. Then Ben sat decently between us. The three of us started rubbing up against each other. "Oh, were you here? You need to hear this story. Let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you a story about me, a woman pushing 50, whose hair's more gray than brown, whose hands bear the wrinkles of time, and whose heart, well, it found itself wandering into uncharted, forbidden territory. My name's Eleanor, and until recently, I thought my life was pretty straightforward. I live alone in a little house on Maple Street. My husband passed away 10 years ago, and since then, I've made do with my routines. Baking cookies, gardening, and playing bridge with the other widows at the community center. All very mundane, very proper. At least, it was until I met him. They moved in next door about 6 months ago, the Haydens. A sweet family, really. Kevin and Lisa are the parents, all smiles and hearty handshakes, and then there's Ben. Ben, their 18-year-old son, who doesn't belong in this neighborhood of retirees and middle-aged couples. He's tall, with shaggy hair and a grin that could melt snow. When he first came over to introduce himself, he called me ma'am. It should have been endearing. Instead, it stung. But as the weeks passed, something changed. He'd wave at me when he got home from school or stop by to help with my garden. I'd brush it off, just a boy being polite. Yet, every time I caught him leaning against the fence, shirt damp from mowing the lawn, I felt an ache deep in my chest. An ache I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't just him, though. There was also Martin. Now, Martin and I have been friends for a few years. He's my age, a little rough around the edges, but charming in his way. We've been lovers on and off, though nothing official. He likes to say we're just keeping each other company. It's a safe arrangement, one that doesn't ask too much of either of us. But lately, whenever Martin touches my hand or pulls me in close, my mind drifts, not to him, but to Ben. And then the guilt floods in, heavy as stone. Now, the cookies. They're my peace offering to the world, my way of pretending everything's fine. It was a chilly December afternoon, just after a light snowfall, when I decided to bake a batch of snickerdoodles. Ben loves them, he told me once when I'd brought them over during Thanksgiving. So, I piled them into a basket, wrapped them in a red checkered cloth, and headed next door. The Haydens' front porch was dusted with snow, and their Christmas wreath sparkled with little golden bells. I knocked softly, expecting Kevin or Lisa to answer. But as I waited, I caught a glimpse through the frosted window pane. What I saw made my breath hitch. Ben, standing in the living room, his arms wrapped around a girl. She wasn't just anyone. She was my best friend's daughter, Evelyn, a petite blonde with a laugh like wind chimes. They were kissing, their bodies pressed together like the cold world outside didn't exist. For a moment, I froze. The basket slipped from my hands, cookies scattering across the porch. I should have walked away, left them to their young love. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, watching, my heart twisting in ways I couldn't understand. What was I feeling? Jealousy? Longing? Shame? Probably all three. And then, just as quickly as it started, the moment ended. Ben pulled away, glanced toward the door, and our eyes met. He saw me. His face went pale, and for a split second, the world stood still. I picked up the basket, muttered something about dropping these, and fled. My cheeks burned as I crossed the lawn, my mind racing. Back in my kitchen, I sat at the table, staring at the cookies I couldn't bring myself to eat. That night, Martin came over. I didn't tell him what happened. Instead, I let him hold me, trying to bury my feelings in his warmth. But even as he kissed me, all I could think about was Ben, his eyes, the way he looked at me, the way he looked at her. It was Christmas Day, and Maple Street was dressed for the occasion. Snow draped over rooftops like frosting, lights twinkled in the early evening dusk, and the faint scent of pine and cinnamon wafted through the air. The Haydens had left that afternoon for last-minute shopping, their car crunching over the icy driveway. I stayed behind, as always, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a book I wasn't really reading. But then, through the lace curtains of my living room window, I saw Ben. He was sneaking back to his house, his arm draped around Evelyn's shoulders. They were laughing, their breath puffing like smoke in the cold air. He unlocked the door and pulled her inside, a little too quickly, as though they didn't want to be seen. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, tugged at me. I put down my book and crossed to the window. The curtains were thin, but I could see well enough. They were in the living room now, Ben pulling Evelyn close. Her arms slid around his neck as their lips met, slow at first, then more urgent. I shouldn't have watched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. My heart hammered in my chest, my palms pressed against the cold glass. Their movements were young, clumsy, but full of a passion I hadn't felt in years. Evelyn's laugh was soft, muffled against Ben's neck as his hands traced the curve of her waist. Unable to take it anymore, I went to their door. I wanted to watch them more closely. And then, as if sensing me, Ben turned. His gaze locked on mine through the window, freezing me in place. For a moment, neither of us moved. I expected him to pull away, to shield Evelyn from view. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I backed away, embarrassed, but the door opened before I could escape. He grabbed me by the arm without saying anything. When he pulled me in, he took a little look around for inspection. Evelyn, with her thin sweater on, was looking at us from the couch with a smile that I couldn't understand. He had dressed quickly, it was obvious. Because she didn't have a bra on underneath. "You were watching," he said, his voice low. His eyes, darker than I remembered, held mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. I wasn't, I started to deny it, but he cut me off, stepping closer. "You don't have to lie," he murmured. His gaze flicked to my lips, then back to my eyes. The air between us was charged, crackling like the fire in the hearth. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine, and I felt my resolve crumbling. He was so close now, the warmth of his body chasing away the winter chill. His breath smelled faintly of peppermint, and when his hand found my cheek, I didn't pull away. "I've seen the way you look at me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Ben, we can't," I started, but the words died in my throat as he leaned in. His lips were soft, tentative, as if he was afraid I'd push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My hands found his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath my palms. His arms circled me, pulling me closer, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. He dragged me inside and sat me down next to Evelyn. Evelyn took off her thin sweater as if she had been waiting for this. He was completely free now. He started running his hands around my neck. His lips were hovering on my cheek without feeling it. As she moved her soft lips around my body, I was also becoming free. I haven't felt young for a long time. I found peace with them. He put his hands inside my clothes. The more he moved his hands around my body, the more I passed out. Then Ben sat decently between us. The three of us started rubbing up against each other. The rest was a blur, a tangle of limbs, soft gasps, and whispered names. Every touch was electric, every kiss a spark that set my skin ablaze. Time seemed to stop, the world outside disappearing until there was nothing left but us. When it was over, we lay there on the rug by the fire, the glow casting shadows across his face. I traced the line of his jaw, my heart heavy with the weight of what we'd done. "This is wrong," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He caught my hand, pressing it to his lips. "Maybe," he said. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could think about was the way his eyes had held mine through that window, how they still held me now, even as guilt and desire warred within me. The sound of a car pulling into the Haydens' driveway shattered the moment. Evelyn and I got up quickly and got dressed. He watched us run towards the door. Before we left, we came back and we both planted kisses on her cheek. "Eleanor," he said softly, "Merry Christmas." After we left the door, Evelyn and I saw eye to eye. After laughing at each other with a smile that no one would understand, but that told us a lot, we went our separate ways. This relationship between us was going to continue.